You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 18th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. It's 2030 in Adelaide, 1900 in Beijing, midday here in London and 1 a.m. in Honolulu. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Hello and a warm welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme.
You've been great. I just wish you'd extend your term another 10 years. You're doing a hell of a job. Seriously.
After Joe Biden praises the outgoing NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, we look at what his probable successor Mark Rutte might have to do to secure the backing of Hungary. Also coming up,
our officials have followed up with the Chinese embassy to express our concern. When you look at the footage, it was a pretty clumsy attempt, frankly.
Why, after a perfectly successful diplomatic trip to Australia, everything turned sour at a signing ceremony between Beijing and Canberra. Plus, as a new exhibition showcasing the life and style of Naomi Campbell opens, we explore why London's Victoria and Albert Museum is so good at fashion. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. How far is Mark Rutte, the leading candidate to be NATO's next Secretary-General, prepared to go to secure the job? It's being reported that he's promised to give Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban an opt-out of NATO activities supporting Ukraine, if Budapest in turn lifts its veto of his proposed appointment. Well, Stephen Erlanger is the New York Times chief diplomatic correspondent. I'm delighted to say he joins me on the line now. Good afternoon, Stephen.
Hello.
So what's Mr. Rutte offered?
Well, in a sense, he's offered what Jens Stoltenberg already offered Orban a couple weeks ago, which is Orban, who doesn't really want to support Ukraine, doesn't think NATO should be helping Ukraine, refuses to let weapons go through Hungary to Ukraine. He's been promised that if he lets Rutte get the job, that he won't have to support Ukraine, that he can opt out of any other NATO efforts, which include coordinating weapons supplies, which include budget support. For NATO itself, it's generally non-lethal support, but obviously NATO countries are quite critical. So basically, it gives Orban a chance to say, well, it's not my fight, and stay inside NATO and give Rutte a pass. Rutte is being backed by almost all NATO's 32 member countries. But Orban has always wanted to trade something for something. Interestingly, the Turkish leader, Erdogan, who normally brings these things to the very last minute, has agreed to support Rutte already. So it's Orban who's really the big issue now.
So what does this mean for the way that Mark Rutte's campaign is viewed, given the fact, albeit you mentioned that Jens Stoltenberg mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, that this might have been discussed with Viktor Orban. But in order to get the job, Mark Rutte must make some compromises which cast NATO in a slightly different light, doesn't it?
Well, it does to some degree. I mean, it's 32 countries. It works by consensus, so any one country can just say no. So it's always a matter of finding consensus. Rutte has, been leader of the Netherlands through many different governments. He's been very good at finding consensus. He's been very good at having difficult coalitions come together. And that's one of the reasons people think he'd be good at this job. People make all kinds of concessions inside NATO. This is one of the, I suppose, more public ones, but it will have no real effect on support for Ukraine, even if it's a little embarrassing.
Indeed, I mean, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg promised renewed military support for Ukraine just last week, and that made enormous headlines. I mean, is there a sense that if Viktor Orban can hold Mark Rutte's feet to the fire, that other countries in future will be able to demand opt-outs?
Well, they would anyway. It doesn't really matter who's actually Secretary General. Being Secretary General of NATO is a bit like being a maître d'. I mean, your job is to pull together countries. I mean, Jens Stoltenberg always got criticized for bending too far toward Turkey, for instance. But he did manage to hold it together, and he did get Turkish approval, finally, of Finland and Sweden, and Orban's approval of Finland and Sweden. And it's always a bit of a negotiation where small countries hold things up to get what they want. So I don't think it's a particularly egregious moral stain, but the job involves compromise. So being able to do it is probably a good thing rather than a bad thing.
We have yet to get public backing from either Slovakia or Romania. I believe their president, Klaus Johannes, had tried to get the NATO job. What do you think might happen there now, given what's just happened with Hungary?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly the Americans want to make sure Rutte's all done by the time we all get to Washington for the 75th anniversary summit early next month. And I think so. I mean, it's just that Johannes, I think, will bargain for himself or for Romania getting quite a good job inside NATO. I mean, that's kind of how it works. So I think it'll be okay. Slovakia's more complicated given, as you remember, its President Robert Fico nearly died in an assassination attempt. And he is also very much not a fan of helping Ukraine. He's, like Orban, quite favorable sometimes to Vladimir Putin. So he, to me, still is the only real card that still has to be played.
And the continued problem that Hungary poses to absolutely every single large supranational bloc that it's a membership of.
Well, that's for sure.
Where does this go next?
Well, I mean, you see it inside the European Union also. I mean, Orban's actually respected inside the EU, partly because he's very smart and partly because he keeps winning elections. Not always very fairly, one would argue. But on all big issues, he ends up conceding. And this is very important. I mean, he has never, for instance, violated a ruling of the European Court, for instance. They've always bent. So he's very good at negotiating, but on the bigger questions, he tends to fold.
Stephen Erlanger, thank you so much for joining us on the line. The time here in London is 8 minutes past midday. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Here's Vincent McAviney now with the summary of the day's other news stories.
Thanks, Emma. President Joe Biden is expected to announce a new program offering a path to citizenship to hundreds of thousands of undocumented spouses of US citizens. The move would protect them from mass deportations, will apply to those who have been in the country for at least 10 years, and will allow them to work in the US legally. The White House believes more than 500,000 people will benefit from the policy. Russian President Vladimir Putin is en route to North Korea, where he'll be meeting with leader Kim Jong-un. The US and South Korea have accused Pyongyang of supplying Russia with artillery and other military equipment, likely in exchange for humanitarian aid. Both countries deny the existence of an arms deal between them, but have vowed to strengthen military ties. China's President Xi Jinping has accused the US of trying to trick China into invading Taiwan. The Chinese leader is reported to have made the comments to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in 2023, which have only come to light now. The US State Department has denied the claims. And Belgium has announced it will buy 15 Airbus multi-role H-145M helicopters for its army and another 2 for its federal police force. The aircraft has a broad range of capabilities and can be reconfigured in minutes from a light attack role with guided weapons to a special operations version. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you, Vincent. The time in Seoul is 9 minutes past 8, 20:08 in Seoul, 9 minutes past midday here in London. Now, for the first time in 9 years, South Korea and China have held high-level talks on diplomacy and security. The two sides were expected to discuss a wide range of issues, including the Korean Peninsula and what's been described as wider international affairs. Well, joining me now from Seoul is John Lee, editor of Korea Pro. Good evening to you, John.
Well, good evening. Thank you for having me.
A pleasure. Do we know what's been said at these talks?
Not at the moment. The meeting has taken place sometime this afternoon, but neither the foreign nor the defense ministries have actually updated us as to what was discussed in that meeting. It's been several hours now, but there's still been no updates. Now, there's been speculation as to what they just talked about, which was, as you mentioned, they talked about international and regional affairs and talked about Korean Peninsula security issues and mutual interests. But we cannot know for certain what they said because of a lack of an update. And it's most likely because those two ministries are really busy with Vladimir Putin's visit to North Korea.
Yes, we'll come to that in a moment. But let's just establish a little bit of the context of this meeting. And like I've just mentioned a moment ago, it is the first time in 9 years that high-level talks have been held between the Chinese and the South Koreans. What is it that brought this opening up of communication channels in the first place?
Well, in the past 2 years, at least, the South Korean and Chinese relations, they've not been at their best, especially with this current South Korean administration. The Yoon administration has focused on improving ties with Japan and the U.S. And in the meantime, ties with China has deteriorated somewhat. But what happened at the end of last month was that there was a trilateral summit between South Korea, China, and Japan. And this had been delayed for a few years, mostly because of the COVID pandemic. But at the end of that summit, they agreed that they were going to have frequent consultations with each other at the ministerial and vice ministerial level in order to, what they said was to make these kinds of talks more regular and scheduled.
How much is China in this agreement more willing to actually normalise the relationship with South Korea, given just how conflicting interests are between the two countries?
Well, there have been some bad blood between these two countries in the past 2 years, but these two countries still need each other quite badly. China and South Korea are right next to each other, right next to each other. And until recently, China was South Korea's largest export market. This has been replaced by the U.S. Very surprisingly in the past year. But this relationship will not go anywhere. And China also requires South Korean technology, semiconductors, and chips. And so although at this point it might appear that South Korea might need China's aid more than the other way around, these two countries do need each other.
Tell us a little bit more about you mentioned the diplomats being rather preoccupied with the Russia-North Korea meeting. Just explain to us a little bit about what both countries are doing in order to react to Putin's visit.
Well, this is Putin's first visit to North Korea in 24 years. The last time he visited, he was meeting with Kim Jong-un's father. And now that he's going to North Korea, the Russian news agency TASS just reported that Putin reportedly ordered a comprehensive partnership agreement to be signed between Russia and North Korea. And this will allow Russia and North Korea to engage in all sorts of cooperation, from trade to technology. It's just one step below a mutual defense agreement. And so because of this going on, South Korea is rightfully worried because, as you also just mentioned, there's been quite a lot of arms trade between those two countries, though they deny it. And this is also going to affect China. China is not at all happy about Russia's increasing influence in North Korea. They want to be the ones calling the shot. And the fact that Putin is visiting North Korea to meet with Kim Jong-un, this is going to ruffle some feathers in Beijing as well. And so it's most likely that during the meeting that South Korea and China had this afternoon, there was a lot of discussions about Putin's visit.
It's an unusual thing because many people are seeing that the South Korea-China meetings being held at the same time that the North Korean and Russian leaders meet in Pyongyang is symbolic, albeit unintentionally so.
Yes, the South Korean government has said that this meeting has completely coincidental, but whether or not that is coincidental, as you just said, the symbolism cannot be overlooked.
Tell us a little bit more about another story that's coming out of Seoul at the moment, if you wouldn't mind, John. It's about the doctors' strikes. Could you bring us an update on that?
This has been going on for more than 4 months now when the doctors first had their strikes. Just this afternoon, just today, about 10,000 South Korean doctors, and by doctors I mean trainee doctors and community doctors, as in those who run clinics, as well as those who work in these large hospitals, staged a one-day general strike. But what's important is that beyond this one-day strike, they also said that if the government does not listen to their demands, and they're demanding that the government withdraw their plans to increase medical school quotas by next year, then the doctors will go on an indefinite strike starting on June 27th.
John Lee, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Seoul. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. 12:15 here in London, 20:45 in Adelaide, and you're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Let's head to Australia now, where what had been a successful diplomatic visit by China's Li Qiang has been overshadowed by a rather heavy-handed display at a signing ceremony. In attendance was the Australian journalist Cheng Lei. Until last year, Cheng was in detention in China on charges of illegally supplying state secrets overseas. Well, she's been released and is now back at work as a presenter and reporter for Sky News Australia. Cheng found her view of the signing blocked by Chinese officials. When someone offered to swap places with her, that view was blocked too. Later, the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had this to say about what happened.
Our officials have followed up with the Chinese embassy to express our concern. When you look at the footage, it was a pretty clumsy attempt, frankly, by a couple of people to stand in between where the cameras were and where Cheng Lei was sitting. And Australian officials intervened, as they should have, to ask the Chinese officials who were there at the press conference to move, and they did so. And indeed, when I held my press conference, Cheng Lei got the first question.
Well, joining us now is David Penberthy, who's a journalist based in Adelaide. Good evening, David.
Good evening. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. Just tell us a little bit more about what happened.
Well, this reporter, Cheng Lei, has been incarcerated in China. She's an Australian national, and subsequent to her release, she's returned to Australia and has been working for Sky News here. And she was covering the event yesterday in Canberra in the same way that so many other journalists were. And as our Prime Minister said, it was a clumsy attempt by some fairly enthusiastic young chap from, we believe, the Chinese embassy here in Australia, or someone from the Chinese consular staff working here, who tried to sort of muscle his way in front of her, obscuring her view. And the optics of it were, I mean, it wasn't a particularly sort of brutal manoeuvre on his part, but the fact that that level of attention was being brought to bear, I think it was a bit of a metaphor more broadly for the tensions that exist between Australia and China. Basically boil down to one of us is a democracy and the other one most clearly isn't. And, you know, for a visit like this, which is what was looming as a bit of a triumph of soft diplomacy, you know, it was all about getting the relationship with China and Australia back on track after the tensions that existed during COVID, when our former Conservative government led by Scott Morrison had been quite sort of blunt and brusque in demanding answers about the origins of COVID. That was the thing that triggered a trade war, which was a proxy battle over trade affecting Australian wine exports, beef exports, grain exports, and lobsters and so forth. And, you know, the whole point of this visit by the Chinese Premier was to show that we'd move beyond that. And this incident with Cheng Lei was a bit of a reminder that as long as our two systems of government are so different, issues like this are inevitably going to arise. And, you know, while we're all sort of trying to be friends again, I think it showed that with two such diametrically opposed systems of government, things like this are always going to become a big challenge.
Indeed. I mean, Cheng told Sky News that she thought that the officials were trying to stop her from saying something or doing something that they think would be a bad look. They didn't want her presence in a moment of positivity for China. But she then said, but that in itself was a bad look. I mean, how much damage do you think has been done?
Well, I think our Prime Minister's been at pains to downplay it. And, you know, he's been trying to sort of, I think, march to two different drums here. He doesn't want to look like he's making too big a thing out of it to get China offside. But equally, there's a lot of people in Australia who are just rolling their eyes about it. And, you know, our view here in Adelaide is the biggest victim of the Chinese trade war was the wine industry. It inflicted the full economic impact of it was about $1.1 billion. But in South Australia, which was basically like the Bordeaux of Australia, we ended up having to stump up about $900 million worth of lost wine exports. And I think a lot of people were just rolling their eyes at the heavy-handedness of China and seeing our Prime Minister sort of walking on eggshells, because yesterday he didn't actually say anything at all about what happened with this reporter. Today he expressed a sort of muted level of unhappiness to the Chinese embassy, as that grab you just played before demonstrated. And I think he's found himself in a bit of a pickle where, on the one hand, he wants to get the relationship back on track. And because there's so many jobs that are dependent on it in Australia for primary producers and for wineries and so forth, people do want to see that succeed. But at the same time, there's a bit of cynicism about it. I mean, the analogy we were using on radio this morning was, it feels like the relationship now between Canberra and Beijing, it's a bit like Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor getting back together. And, you know, it's all meant to be happy campers now, but who knows what's going to happen the next time there's a flare up in the South China Sea or worse than that, if there's some sort of conflagration in Taiwan. So we're happy that things are getting better, but the incident with Cheng Li was a bit of a reminder that structurally this relationship has some major challenges still. And
instead of, dare I say it, the offering of the Krupp diamond, we have the offering of pandas.
That's right. Yeah, no, the Adelaide Zoo here in my hometown, the pandas, Wang Wang and Funi, the male and female pandas that we've had on loan from China since about 2010, they're part of a breeding program. Unfortunately, they haven't managed to trouble the scorer yet in terms of procreating. Maybe it's the heat down here, but they haven't managed to successfully breed at all. But it's been a big sort of for the fanfare that it attracted in much happier times for the relationship between Australia and China back in 2010 when they sent the pandas out. There was a lot of rapprochement between the two countries that coincided with the rolling out of a lot of these Confucius institutes at Australian universities. But since then, and particularly during COVID, it attracted a lot of cynicism. But the fact that the panda program has been extended and China's now decreed that it's going to be sending another breeding pair down here, hopefully that they will successfully breed on this occasion as well. That and all the wine visits and everything else, the whole point of the trip and the extension of the panda arrangement was to show that the relationship is back on track. So, you know, whether that succeeds is yet to be seen. And as we saw yesterday, there's always going to be these challenges, because it feels like on any given day there's a story about how China's ready to start taking wine exports from Australia. It's ready to start taking Australian beef, but then there'll be some quasi sort of military flare-up in the South China Sea, as there was only a couple of months ago, involving Australian defence personnel, that puts it all, back on the skids again.
David Penberthy, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Adelaide. You're listening to The Briefing live on Monocle Radio. Now, Thailand's government has approved the right to same-sex marriage. It's a move which is being seen as an endorsement of a country as a relative haven in Asia for the LGBTQ community. James Chambers is Monocle's Asia editor based in Bangkok, and he joins us now. Welcome back, James.
Hi, Emma.
So tell us a little bit about the law. What does it entail?
So it's the Marriage Equality Bill. It's meant to give couples of any gender the same rights. So it kind of removes the gender terms male and female and just recognises marriage as a partnership between two individuals. So same-sex couples will have the same rights of adoption and inheritance and things like that as men and women do. So it's been hailed as a monumental step for Thailand and for Asia as a whole. And today was, I guess, the final vote in the upper house, the Senate in Thailand. And senators gave it an overwhelming yes. And now it'll be go to the palace for royal assent, and then in 4 months' time it'll become law.
How easy or difficult has it been for this to become part of Thai law?
Well, I think Thailand has kind of missed a trick here because, as you said, it is one of the leaders when it comes to kind of the LGBT community. It's a destination for people to come to celebrate Pride. I mean, Pride's going on right now, and it's a full month of celebrations here. But it's taken until 2024 for Thailand to take this formal move, and it's actually lost out to other countries like Taiwan and Nepal, who have beaten it to bring in these formal measures. But this is a case of the lawmakers actually catching up with society. There's overwhelming support for this move in Thailand. We're talking about polls north of 90% public support for it, and that's been there for a long time. The Parliament has been trying to pass something like this for the last 20 years. So it's great that it's finally got there, but I wouldn't say that people and society has been waiting for this moment.
So will this culturally change Thailand in any way?
I mean, it's hard for me to speak on behalf of what it's like for the LGBT community here, but I'm sure, of course, it will help, because although there is a lot more visibility here in Thailand when compared to other parts of Asia, when it comes to the employment and family, they haven't been afforded the same kind of rights and protection. So that will, of course, make a huge difference for them. And of course, it'll help Thailand, lead the region, and particularly Southeast Asia. It is the first country in Southeast Asia to take this big step. This is quite a conservative part of the world. So when you talk about Thai leadership and Thai soft power, this is an area which it can really take the lead. And I imagine they're going to really leverage this and build on this going forward. So they're going to be applying to host various LGBT global events, including one next year, and really build on Thailand and Bangkok as a destination for the LGBT community.
James, while we have you here, the former Prime Minister of Thailand, Thaksin Shinawatra, has been formally indicted for allegedly insulting the monarchy in 2015. And what does this now mean?
Yes, it's been a busy day here in Thailand. We've had the Senate voting on the Marriage Equality Bill, but at the same time, the courts have been very busy with 4 cases. Two of the major ones were involved the Prime Minister and the opposition party Move Forward, and they've got a new date now for the next hearing in July. But as you mentioned, Thaksin, who's the former Prime Minister, who was ousted by the military in 2006 and then went into self-imposed exile, he returned to Thailand last year, and his party, Thai, actually lead the coalition right now. But he was charged in May, or indicted with an offence, a lèse-majesté offence, relating to something he'd said in an interview in 2015 to a South Korean newspaper when he was in exile. And these cases, these Section 112 cases, are always they appear to be used to silence critics of the government. And in this case, it may be seen as a way of perhaps silencing Thaksin, or maybe getting him to stop being so involved in politics. When he came back, he was sentenced to jail for other crimes or alleged corruption and bribery when he was in power, but he didn't serve any time in jail because he was apparently very critically ill, and he spent 6 months in hospital before being released. And I guess the understanding was that when he was released, he was going to go away quietly and perhaps retire. But since then, he's been very active in Thailand, and there is a suggestion that this case, this indictment, might be a way of the kind of conservative powers that be reminding Thaksin about the deal they made, and perhaps holding it above his head as a kind of sword of Damocles, so that if he does continue to step out of line or overreach, so they can always use this against him. So even though he's going to be due back in court in August, he was out on bail today, it might not be something that is resolved that quickly. It might just kind of hang around for the foreseeable future.
James Chambers, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing. You're with Monocle Radio. Finally, on today's programme, London's Victoria and Albert Museum launches a new exhibition this weekend, celebrating the life and style of the supermodel Naomi Campbell. It's the latest in a series of similar shows at the V&A, dedicated to fashion giants such as Coco Chanel and David Bowie. Well, Rebecca Cope is a freelance fashion writer for The Telegraph newspaper and the Sunday Times style section. She joins us now. Good afternoon, Rebecca.
Hi, Emma. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So do we know what's in this exhibition?
Yes, so it's divided into 3 different sections, and it has about 100 outfits chosen by Campbell herself, things that she wore in a personal or professional capacity from her own archives, some of which she said she actually had forgotten that she still owned. And then there is a photography section curated by her good friend and the ex-editor of British Vogue, Edward Enninful, which features things like, I imagine, her first ever French Vogue cover, which saw her as the first black model ever to appear on French Vogue from 1988, her first British Vogue cover from 1987, and other collaborations with some of the greatest photographers of the time, so Tim Walker, Stephen Meisel, Nick Knight. And then finally, there's a section about her activism and philanthropy, which I think is probably why she's been chosen as a subject for the V&A. Indeed, because the V&A usually reserves this honour for designers and photographers and for the people who do more than just model, if that is possible to say that. What is it about Campbell which makes her, sort of elevates her to that position? Well, it's interesting you mention that, because actually, a decade ago, it would have been considered unusual for the V&A to profile a designer. It was only in 2015 when they had the Alexander McQueen exhibition, and it was such a runway success that they really started with this kind of, fashion extravaganza model. And what makes Campbell such a important figure, and one who is, deserving of an exhibition in this way, is that she's in many ways more than just a model. She's a cultural icon. She has consistently worked for the last 40 years. Their year doesn't go by when she's not walking on the catwalks or appearing in photo shoots or on magazine covers. And she kind of transcends, the term model. She's Naomi. She's a one name figure, much like the name of this exhibition. And she's broken so many barriers along the way as a Black woman.
There are certain moments in her life for which she is famous not because of what she modelled, or rather what she wore, but how she wore it. The first one is the fact that the outfit that she wore when she fell over at a Vivienne Westwood show is going to be part of it, as is the Dolce & Gabbana gown that she wore after finishing community service in New York.
Yes, and to be fair to her, she was en route to Elton John's, I think, 60th birthday party after that, which is why she was dressed like that. And so, yeah, she has, obviously there are so many landmark moments that she's been part of, as you touched on, the Vivienne Westwood heels that she famously fell in. But I think actually it was her reaction to that moment that has, been part of the kind of her sort of myth. The photographs of her when she fell, she's laughing, she's smiling, she's not storming off or anything like that. And for Gen Z now, she's become kind of this, a bit of a meme, especially with the Dolce & Gabbana look that you were referencing too. It's all over TikTok, references to that moment.
Tell us a little bit more about the V&A, how it pulls these events and exhibitions together, but also how it seems to get it so right.
Sure. So the V&A chairman, Nicholas Coleridge, has said before that, it takes them 3 years typically to kind of pull these things together. So the conversations will have been ongoing with Naomi Campbell for quite some time before they announced it. And they will be looking, obviously, first and foremost, at what she has in her archive, but also thinking about the story that they want to tell. So they'll be thinking about what were the key moments from her career so far and which items in her wardrobe will illustrate these. So obviously there's the Vivienne Westwood shoes, but there's also an Azadine Alaya dress that's in the exhibition. And she's spoken a lot about how he as a designer was someone that really fostered her career and encouraged her. And, she referred to him as a father figure in his lifetime. So they'll be weaving in that narrative all the time when they're looking at what to include in the exhibition. And in terms of the success of the V&A's fashion exhibitions, no one really does it like them. They've almost made it a sort of status symbol to get a ticket to one of these, like, akin to getting into Glastonbury. The Chanel exhibition was sold out almost immediately and was only ever really accessible in the later months if you became a member. And Dior as well had to keep being extended. McQueen broke records when it reached 100,000 tickets sold back in 2015. They've just become really good at creating these major exhibition moments in a way.
Rebecca Cope, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer, Vincent McAviney. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing's back tomorrow at the same time. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.